The diplomatic quarters aboard Nexus Station buzzed with the quiet efficiency that marked all major trade hubs in the Galactic Alliance. Jake Morrison stood before the massive observation window in his assigned suite, watching cargo haulers drift between the station's massive pylons like mechanical whales in a sea of stars. 3 days until the trade summit concluded, and he could finally return to Earth with the mineral rights agreements that would secure humanity's expansion into the Kepler sector. His reflection stared back at him from the reinforced plasteel. Average height for a human male, brown hair kept regulation short, green eyes that his sister always said were too serious for his own good. At 32, Jake had spent the better part of a decade learning to navigate the complex web of alien politics that governed the galaxy's most profitable trade routes. He understood the ritualistic greetings of the insectoid Cathara, could interpret the subtle color shifts that indicated a Aquarian diplomat's mood, and had even mastered the intricate hand signing that the silicon-based Christek used in formal negotiations. But he had never encountered anything quite like the Vorthak. The door chimed and Jake's aide, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, stepped through with her usual brisk efficiency. "Sir, the Vorthak delegation has requested a private meeting. Ambassador Thakaris specifically asked for you." Jake turned from the window, straightening his diplomatic uniform jacket. "Any idea what they want?" "The trade agreements are already finalized." Sarah consulted her datapad, her expression carefully neutral. The request came through their military attaché, not their trade representative. "Commander Zarathek. She mentioned something about a matter of honor. Military?" Jake frowned. "The Vorthak were known for their rigid separation of military and civilian authority. For a warrior to request a meeting during trade negotiations was unusual, to say the least. Did she give any specifics?" "No, sir, but—" Sarah hesitated, then met his eyes. "I did some research on Vorthak military customs after her request came in. Their concept of honor is complex and very personal." The meeting room in the neutral section of Nexus Station was deliberately sparse. White walls, a simple table, chairs designed to accommodate the anatomical variations of a dozen different species. Jake arrived 5 minutes early, a habit drilled into him by years of diplomatic protocol. He had barely settled into his chair when the door opened. Commander Zarathek entered with the fluid grace that characterized all Vorthak movement. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, her humanoid frame wrapped in midnight blue scales that caught the room's ambient light like polished metal. Her facial features were elegantly angular with high cheekbones and a strong jawline that spoke of predatory heritage. Golden eyes, cat-like in their vertical pupils, fixed on Jake with an intensity that made his instincts whisper warnings about apex predators. She wore her military uniform with casual confidence, dark fabric that complemented her natural coloring with rank insignia that Jake recognized as equivalent to his own commander status. Her long platinum-white hair was bound in a complex braid that incorporated what looked like small metal ornaments. Each movement she made was controlled, precise, like a dancer who could explode into violence at a moment's notice. "Commander Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the slight rumble that marked Vorthak's speech. The universal translator rendered her words in crisp, unaccented English, but Jake caught the underlying harmonics that the device couldn't quite capture. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "Commander Zarathek," Jake replied, rising to offer the formal greeting gesture used between military officers of different species. A shallow bow with hands visible. "How can I assist you?" Instead of returning the greeting, Zarathek remained standing, her golden eyes never leaving his face. "I have observed you during the trade negotiations. You carry yourself as a warrior, yet you serve as a diplomat." "This intrigues me." Jake felt his eyebrows rise slightly. "I served in the Earth Defense Force before joining the Diplomatic Corps, but I'm not sure I understand your interest." "Among my people," Zarathek continued, beginning to circle the table with predatory grace, "there exists a tradition. When a warrior encounters another who demonstrates qualities of strength, intelligence, and honor, they may issue a formal challenge, not for dominance, but for evaluation." The word she used in her native language didn't translate cleanly, and Jake's earpiece offered several alternatives: assessment, testing, courtship, trial. The last option made his pulse quicken uncomfortably. "Commander," Jake said carefully, "I think there might be some cultural misunderstanding here. Humans don't typically—" "You fascinate me, Jake Morrison." The use of his first name sent an unexpected shiver down his spine. "In the negotiations, you demonstrated patience when the Caithara representative became aggressive. You showed creativity when the Christek delegation reached an impasse over processing rights. And when Ambassador Veltar attempted to manipulate the mineral percentages through misdirection, you countered with facts presented so elegantly that he had no choice but to concede without losing face. She had stopped directly across from him, her hands resting on the back of the chair, in what might have been a casual gesture if not for the way her claws, which he was just now noticing, left small scores in the metal. These are the qualities my people value in a potential mate. The translator's clinical delivery of that statement made it somehow more jarring. Jake felt his mouth go dry. "Commander, I'm flattered, but I am not requesting your immediate commitment," Zarathek interrupted, and Jake caught what might have been amusement in her tone. "Among the Vorthak, compatibility must be proven through trial. I propose a series of challenges, 7 tests that will demonstrate whether you possess the qualities necessary for a true partnership. And if I refuse..." For the first time since entering the room, Zarathek showed something other than predatory confidence. Her head tilted slightly and her expression became genuinely curious. "Then I would be disappointed, but I would respect your choice. However," she leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the table, "I do not believe you will refuse. What makes you so certain? Because, Jake Morrison, you are curious. I see it in your eyes when you look at me. I hear it in your voice when you ask questions about my people's customs. You wonder what it would be like to accept my challenge." She was right, and that was the most disturbing part. Jake had spent years studying alien cultures, but always from the safe distance of academic interest. The idea of actually participating in a Vorthak bonding ritual was both terrifying and fascinating. What would these trials involve? He heard himself ask. Zarathek's expression shifted into what could only be described as a predatory smile, revealing teeth that were definitely sharper than human normal. Strength, speed, intelligence, creativity, courage, endurance, and finally the trial of understanding. Combat trials? Some, but not all. The Vorthak do not seek merely a warrior as a mate, but a complete partner. Each trial tests different aspects of what we consider essential qualities. Jake thought about his service record, his diplomatic training, the countless hours he'd spent in Earth Defense Force simulations. He was competent, certainly, but competing against a member of a species evolved for predatory excellence was another matter entirely. When would these trials take place? The first, tonight. If you accept, we begin with the trial of strength. Physical combat, limited rules, victory by submission or incapacitation. And if I lose, then you lose. But the trials continue until all 7 are complete, regardless of individual outcomes. The overall pattern determines success or failure. Jake looked into those golden eyes and realized he was about to make either the best or worst decision of his life. I accept. The cargo bay that Zarathek had arranged for their first trial was empty, except for a marked combat circle and basic medical equipment. Jake had changed into his physical training gear, simple black workout clothes that allowed for maximum mobility. Across from him, Zarathek wore what appeared to be traditional Vorthak combat attire, fitted dark pants and a sleeveless top that showcased the elegant musculature of her arms and shoulders. "Rules are simple," she explained, rotating her shoulders in a warm-up stretch that made Jake acutely aware of just how outclassed he was physically. "Combat continues until one of us yields or cannot continue. No weapons, no deliberately permanent injury. Honor demands that we both give our best effort." Jake nodded, trying to center himself the way his combat instructors had taught him. "Understood." "One additional element," Zarathek added, and her tone carried a note of formality that made him pay attention. In Vorthak tradition, the challenge party may set one condition for each trial. What is your condition for the trial of strength? Jake thought about it. He was going to lose. That much was obvious. Zarathek probably outweighed him by 50 pounds, and every ounce of that was clearly muscle and bone evolved for physical dominance. But maybe he could learn something useful for the future trials. "No time limit," he said finally. "The fight continues until one of us can't." Zarathek's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You wish to prolong your defeat?" "I wish to understand my opponent." For a moment something shifted in her expression. Surprise, perhaps, or approval. Then she settled into a combat stance that was unlike anything Jake had seen in human martial arts. Her center of gravity dropped low, her hands curved into positions that would allow either grappling or striking, and her entire posture radiated coiled potential energy. "Begin when ready," she said. Jake circled left, trying to get a sense of her movement patterns. Zarathek pivoted to track him, but didn't advance. She was studying him just as he was studying her, which was encouraging. At least she wasn't planning to simply bulldoze through his defenses. He feinted advanced toward her right side, watching how she responded. Her reaction time was faster than human normal, but not impossibly so. When he actually committed to an attack, a quick jab aimed at her midsection, she flowed aside with liquid grace and countered with a strike toward his shoulder that he barely managed to deflect. The impact sent shockwaves through his entire arm. For the next 10 minutes, Jake fought the most technically perfect losing battle of his life. Zarathek was stronger, faster, and more skilled than he was, but she wasn't treating him like a punching bag. Instead, she seemed to be conducting her own form of evaluation, testing his responses to different types of attacks, gauging his recovery time, measuring his adaptability. Jake managed to land 3 solid hits during those 10 minutes. The first caught her off guard as she overcommitted to what should have been a finishing throw. The second came when he sacrificed his balance to get inside her longer reach and delivered an elbow strike to her ribs that actually made her grunt in surprise. The third happened when he deliberately left himself open to a takedown, then used her momentum against her to reverse their positions briefly. None of his successes lasted long. Each time, Zarathek adapted and returned to dominance with what seemed like effortless superiority. But Jake noticed something interesting. She was breathing harder than she had been at the start, and there was a light in her eyes that suggested she was actually enjoying the challenge. When he finally couldn't continue, caught in a submission hold that left him no option but to tap out or risk serious injury, Jake was exhausted, bruised, and oddly exhilarated. Zarathek released him immediately and stepped back, offering a hand to help him to his feet. "You fought well." "I lost," Jake pointed out, accepting her assistance and trying not to wince at the dozen places where he'd be feeling this tomorrow. "Yes, but you lost with intelligence and creativity, and you lasted longer than I expected." She paused, studying his face with those unsettling golden eyes. "Tell me, Jake Morrison, what did you learn?" It was clearly a test question, and Jake considered his answer carefully. "You could have ended the fight much sooner. You were holding back." "Obviously. What else?" "You fight like someone who's trained against opponents similar to yourself. Your techniques are optimized for dealing with other Vorthak. Against a smaller, differently proportioned opponent, you had to adapt." Zarathek's expression shifted into something that might have been approval. And Jake thought about the moments when he'd actually managed to surprise her, the brief instances when his different approach had caught her off guard. You're not used to fighting someone who doesn't mind losing. Most opponents would have been focused on winning, which makes their strategies predictable. I was focused on learning. Exactly. Zarathek moved to the small table where she'd left water bottles, tossing one to Jake and keeping one for herself. The trial of strength is not merely about physical capability. It reveals character, adaptability, and the willingness to continue fighting even when victory seems impossible. So did I pass? There is no passing or failing individual trials, she reminded him. But you demonstrated qualities that interest me. The next trial will be tomorrow evening. Speed and agility. As they left the cargo bay together, Jake found himself looking forward to the next challenge despite the aches already settling into his muscles. Whatever game Zarathek was playing, it was more complex than simple physical competition, and for the first time since accepting her challenge, Jake began to think he might actually have a chance of understanding her people's concept of compatibility. He was going to lose the speed trial too, of course, but he was beginning to suspect that winning and losing might not be the point after all. Jake woke the next morning feeling like he'd been trampled by a cargo hauler. Every muscle in his body protested as he rolled out of bed, and the mirror revealed a collection of bruises that painted his torso in shades of purple and blue. But underneath the physical discomfort was something unexpected. Anticipation. The speed trial. Zarathek hadn't provided many details, but Jake had spent the early hours of the morning researching Vorthak physiology and culture through the station's databases. What he'd found was both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because Vorthak speed trials weren't necessarily about raw velocity. They tested reaction time, tactical thinking under pressure, and the ability to make split-second decisions in complex environments. Jake's military training and diplomatic experience had honed exactly those skills. Terrifying because the same research revealed that Vorthak reflexes were approximately 40% faster than human baseline, and their culture viewed speed not just as a physical attribute but as an expression of mental clarity and spiritual focus. Lieutenant Chen found him in the station's human-compatible gymnasium, working through a carefully modified combat routine designed to loosen his abused muscles without aggravating his injuries. "Sir," she said, settling onto a nearby bench with her datapad, "I've been doing some additional research on Vorthak mating customs." Jake paused in his stretching routine. and complicated. The trials aren't just about proving compatibility. They're about demonstrating that the challenge party can adapt to Vorthak cultural standards while maintaining their own essential nature. Meaning Commander Zarathek isn't trying to turn you into a Vorthak. She's trying to determine if you can function as an equal partner within her cultural framework while remaining fundamentally human. Jake considered this while rotating his shoulder carefully. That's oddly reassuring. There's more. Sarah's expression was troubled. The trials also serve as a public declaration of serious intent. By challenging you, Commander Zarathek has essentially announced to her people that she considers you a potential life partner. If you complete all 7 trials, regardless of how many you win or lose, Vorthak law will recognize you as her equal in status and authority. And if I don't complete them, then you're considered to have rejected her, and any further romantic pursuit on her part would be seen as dishonorable. Jake stopped stretching entirely. She's putting her reputation on the line. More than that. According to what I've found, high-ranking Vorthak military officers rarely issue these challenges. The risk of rejection is too great. If you withdraw from the trials, it could damage her standing with her own people permanently. That information stayed with Jake throughout the day as he attended the final trade negotiations. He found himself watching Zarathek during the formal sessions, noting the respectful attention her subordinates paid her, the deference other Vorthak delegations showed her rank and opinions. She carried authority like a natural element of her being, never having to raise her voice or assert dominance overtly. During a break between sessions, their eyes met across the negotiation chamber. Zarathek inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, and Jake caught something in her expression that he hadn't noticed before. For all her predatory confidence, she was taking a significant personal risk by pursuing these trials. That evening, Jake arrived at the designated location to find that Zarathek had arranged something far more complex than a simple race. The space was one of Nexus Station's maintenance bays, temporarily reconfigured into what looked like a 3-dimensional obstacle course. Platforms suspended at various heights, narrow beams requiring careful balance, rope climbs and precision jumps that would test every aspect of speed and agility. But the most challenging element was the addition of multiple automated systems designed to provide random obstacles. Mechanical arms that would swing across pathways at unpredictable intervals, gravity fields that could be activated to create sudden resistance, holographic barriers that would appear and disappear without warning. The trial of speed, Zarathek explained, gesturing to the complex course, measures not only physical velocity but the ability to process information quickly and adapt to changing circumstances. She wore a form-fitting outfit similar to the previous night's combat gear. Jake had chosen simple athletic wear again, though he'd added light padding at Sarah's suggestion. We'll run the course simultaneously, Zarathek continued. 2 identical paths side by side. First to complete 3 circuits wins, but completion time is only one factor. The course will monitor our decision-making speed, route optimization, and adaptation to unexpected obstacles. Jake studied the course, mapping potential paths and identifying the most challenging sections. My condition for this trial? Yes? He thought about Sarah's research, about the cultural implications of these challenges, about the fact that Zarathek was risking her reputation on his ability to understand and adapt to her people's way of measuring worth. I want to modify the course. Zarathek's eyebrows rose. How? Add a cooperative element. Sections where we have to work together to proceed, where individual speed becomes less important than coordination. For a long moment, Zarathek studied his face with those unsettling golden eyes. That is, not traditional. If this is about proving compatibility, shouldn't teamwork be as important as individual capability? Something shifted in her expression. Surprise, definitely, but also what might have been approval. You continue to intrigue me, Jake Morrison. Very well. We'll incorporate 3 cooperative challenges into the standard course. The modifications took an additional hour to implement, but the result was unlike any agility trial Jake had ever seen. Now, there were sections where both runners had to coordinate their timing to avoid obstacles that responded to their combined presence, puzzle elements that required 2 people working together to solve, and bridge crossings that would only stabilize when both participants moved in synchronized patterns. Ready? Zarathek asked, settling into a starting crouch that made her look like a coiled spring. As I'll ever be. The starting signal was a simple tone, and Zarathek exploded into motion with a grace that made Jake's carefully planned acceleration look clumsy by comparison. But he hadn't expected that. What he hadn't expected was how quickly she adapted to his different approach to the course. Where Zarathek used pure speed and athletic ability to blast through obstacles, Jake relied on efficiency and route optimization. He took slightly longer paths that avoided the most challenging elements, used momentum conservation to maintain velocity through turns, and approached each obstacle as a problem to be solved rather than a barrier to be overcome through force. The first cooperative challenge came at the end of the initial circuit, a section where both runners had to traverse a narrow beam while mechanical arms swept back and forth at different heights. Success required precise timing and coordination. Pattern analysis suggests optimal crossing time is 17 seconds, Jake called out as they approached. Can you match my pace rather than your natural speed? You want me to slow down? I want us to succeed. It was a risk. Asking a Vorthak to deliberately limit their natural capabilities might be seen as insulting, but Zarathak didn't hesitate. She matched his rhythm as they moved through the swinging obstacles, ducking and weaving in perfect synchronization. When they reached the other side, she was actually breathing hard, not from exertion, but from the mental effort required to maintain precise timing at an unnatural pace. Interesting approach, she commented as they began the second circuit. The second cooperative challenge was a puzzle that required both runners to manipulate different control systems simultaneously to open a passage. Jake attacked it like a diplomatic negotiation, calling out his observations and listening to Zarathek's input before committing to any actions. Left panel shows power distribution, he said, studying his side of the interface. What's your panel indicating? Routing options. Multiple pathways, but they change based on power allocation. Try 30% to the primary and 70% to the secondary. I think the pathways will stabilize at that ratio. You think? Or you know? I think. But thinking fast is better than knowing slowly. Zarathek implemented his suggestion, and the passage opened immediately. As they continued through the course, Jake began to notice something remarkable. They were developing a rhythm together, a coordination that went beyond the specific cooperative challenges. The third circuit was where everything came together. The final cooperative challenge was the most complex, a bridge that would only extend as long as both runners maintained perfectly synchronized movement. Too fast or too slow, and the bridge would retract, sending them back to the beginning of the section. This requires absolute trust, Zarathek observed, studying the mechanism. Yes. Are you willing to follow my lead on this one? Again, that flash of surprise in her golden eyes. You're asking a Vorthak warrior to submit to human timing? I'm asking my trial partner to work with me instead of against the course. The distinction mattered, apparently. Zarathek nodded once, settling into position beside him. Led. The bridge crossing was the most intense 60 seconds of Jake's life. Every step had to be perfectly timed, every movement coordinated with Zarathek's. But instead of feeling constrained by the need for synchronization, Jake found himself exhilarated by the seamless way they moved together. When they reached the far side, both breathing hard from concentration rather than physical effort, Zarathek was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. Time! She called out, and the course system stopped their monitoring. Who won? Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. You completed the course 8 seconds faster than I did, Zarathek replied, and Jake could hear the amazement in her voice. That's not possible. Check the displays yourself. Jake looked at the time readouts and felt his mouth fall open. Not only had he beaten Zarathek's time, he'd beaten it by a significant margin. How? Because you understood something about speed that I had not considered, Zarathek said slowly. Velocity is not always about individual capability. Sometimes the fastest path is the one taken with a partner. They spent the next hour reviewing the course recordings, and Jake began to understand what had happened. In the individual sections, Zarathek had indeed been faster. But the cooperative elements had given Jake opportunities to save time that pure athletic ability couldn't match. More importantly, his approach had influenced her performance, causing her to think differently about efficiency and route optimization. You changed how I ran the course, she observed as they watched the recordings. In the second circuit, I began using your methods even in the individual sections. Did that bother you? No. The answer came immediately, without hesitation. It taught me something new. Among my people, that is considered a great gift. As they prepared to leave, Jake found himself curious about something that had been bothering him since the first trial. Zaratek, can I ask you something personal? Yes. Why me? You could have your choice of partners from your own people. Why challenge a human? For a moment, her predatory mask slipped completely, revealing something vulnerable and surprisingly lonely. Because my people understand Vorthak methods. They know how to respond to our traditions, our trials, our ways of measuring worth. But they don't surprise me. They don't make me think differently about concepts I thought I understood completely. She paused, looking out at the stars visible through the bay's observation ports. In the trade negotiations, I watched you handle impossible situations with creativity I had never seen before. You found solutions that satisfied everyone involved, even when their requirements seemed mutually exclusive. That kind of thinking, it intrigues me. And you thought that might translate to personal compatibility? I thought it might translate to growth. For both of us. As Jake made his way back to his quarters, he reflected on the day's events. 2 trials down, 5 to go. He was 0 for 2 in terms of traditional victories, but something else was happening in these challenges. Something that felt more like discovery than competition. The next trial was intelligence, and for the first time since accepting Zarathek's challenge, Jake was beginning to feel confident about his chances. Not because he thought he could outsmart a Vorthak warrior, but because he was starting to understand that these trials weren't really about winning or losing. They were about learning to see each other clearly, and in that game, Jake was beginning to suspect they were both already winning. Jake spent the morning before the 3rd trial in the station's library section, not researching Vorthak customs this time, but trying to understand Zarathek herself. The previous 2 challenges had taught him that these trials were as much about her discovering him as they were about him proving himself. Each test revealed something new about how her mind worked, how she approached problems, what she valued beyond simple physical capability. The intelligence trial was scheduled for mid-afternoon in one of the station's conference rooms. Jake arrived to find the space transformed into something resembling a tactical planning center. Multiple display screens showed star charts, trade route data, diplomatic communications, and what appeared to be a complex scenario involving multiple political factions. Zarathek was already there, studying the displays with the focused intensity he was beginning to recognize as her analytical mode. She wore her standard military uniform, but her hair was bound in a simpler style that suggested she expected to be working rather than fighting. "Commander," Jake said as he entered. "Jake." The informal use of his name had become natural between them over the past 2 days. "Welcome to the trial of intelligence. Please examine the scenario." Jake spent several minutes studying the displays, gradually piecing together a complex political situation. The scenario involved a disputed star system claimed by 3 different factions: the Hegemony, a militaristic alliance similar to the old Earth colonial powers, the Free Trade Consortium, a loose economic confederation, and the Indigenous Coalition, representing the original inhabitants of several worlds in the region. Each faction had legitimate claims to the system based on different criteria: historical precedent, economic development, native rights. More complicating, there were overlapping trade agreements, mutual defense pacts, and resource extraction contracts that made any simple resolution impossible. "The situation has been in diplomatic deadlock for 2 years, Zarathek explained. Multiple mediation attempts have failed. Military tensions are escalating. 3 days ago, shots were fired between Hegemony and Consortium patrol ships, though no one was killed." "And this is the intelligence trial? We will each propose a solution to the crisis. Our approaches will be evaluated by the station's diplomatic AI for feasibility, likely outcomes, and overall effectiveness. The better solution wins." Jake nodded, then looked at the setup more carefully. "My condition for this trial? Yes. We work on this together. Not competing solutions, but a collaborative approach to the problem." Zaratek's expression shifted into what he was learning to recognize as her thinking face, a slight narrowing of her eyes, a tilt of her head that suggested she was examining the request from multiple angles. That would be unprecedented. The trial of intelligence traditionally measures individual analytical capability, but real intelligence often comes from combining different perspectives, especially in complex political situations where multiple viewpoints need to be understood and addressed. "You continue to challenge my assumptions about these trials," she said slowly. "Very well. We will work together. But how do we determine success if we're not competing?" Jake considered this. "We succeed if our solution is better than either of us could have developed alone. The AI can evaluate our individual preliminary approaches against our combined final proposal." "Agreed. But I reserve the right to submit my own solution if our collaboration fails to produce something viable." "Of course." "Same here." They spent the first hour working separately, each developing their own understanding of the scenario and potential approaches. Jake found himself drawn to the diplomatic complexities, mapping the web of relationships and obligations that constrained each faction's options. Zarathek, he noticed, was focusing more on the strategic implications, analyzing resource flows and military capabilities. When they came together to compare notes, Jake was surprised by how differently they had approached the same problem. "You see this as a security crisis that requires managed resolution," Jake observed, studying her preliminary analysis. "You see it as a communication failure that requires improved dialogue," she countered. "Both perspectives have merit. What if we're both right? What if this is a situation where security concerns and communication breakdowns are feeding off each other?" Zarathek leaned back in her chair, her golden eyes bright with interest. "Continue? Look at the timeline." Each faction has taken actions that they viewed as defensive or protective, but that appeared aggressive or threatening to the others. The hegemony increased patrols to protect their mining facilities. The consortium interpreted this as preparation for territorial seizure and reinforced their own shipping routes. The indigenous coalition saw both responses as evidence that their concerns were being ignored and began organizing protest blockades. "A classic escalation spiral," Zarathek agreed, "but recognizing the pattern doesn't necessarily suggest a solution. No, but it suggests an approach. Instead of trying to resolve the territorial dispute directly, we focus on breaking the escalation cycle." They worked for another 2 hours, building a solution that combined Zarathek's strategic thinking with Jake's diplomatic expertise. The result was more complex than either of their individual approaches, but also more comprehensive. Their proposal involved establishing a temporary joint administration for the disputed system, with representatives from all three factions sharing authority under the supervision of a neutral Galactic Alliance Oversight Committee. Economic benefits would be distributed according to a formula that acknowledged each faction's claims while providing incentives for cooperation. Military forces would be withdrawn and replaced by a mixed peacekeeping force with personnel from all three factions. Most importantly, their solution included a structured communication protocol that required regular consultation between the factions on all major decisions, with built-in mediation mechanisms to prevent future escalation cycles. Jake uploaded their collaborative proposal, then looked at Zarathek. "Did you prepare an individual solution as well?" "Yes." "Did you?" "Yes." They submitted all three proposals and waited while the AI conducted its analysis. Jake found himself oddly nervous. Not about winning or losing, but about whether their collaboration had actually produced something better than their individual efforts. "Evaluation complete," the AI announced. "Individual proposal from Commander Morrison shows excellent understanding of diplomatic complexities and stakeholder concerns. Projected success probability, 43%. Primary weakness, insufficient attention to security concerns and enforcement mechanisms." Jake winced. That was a significant flaw in his approach. Individual proposal from Commander Zarathek demonstrates strong strategic analysis and practical implementation planning. Projected success probability, 30 to 8%. Primary weakness, inadequate consideration of underlying political grievances and communication failures. Zarathek's expression remained neutral, but Jake caught a slight tightening around her eyes. Collaborative proposal shows synthesis of both approaches with significant additional innovations. Projected success probability 71%. Strengths include comprehensive stakeholder analysis, practical implementation strategy, built-in conflict prevention mechanisms, and adaptive governance structure. Jake felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with winning and everything to do with validation of their teamwork. Furthermore, the AI continued, analysis of the collaborative development process shows evidence of genuine intellectual synthesis. Both participants contributed essential elements, and the final proposal contains innovations that neither individual approach included. "Meaning?" Zarathek asked. "Meaning you created something new together, rather than simply combining existing ideas. This suggests high compatibility for collaborative problem-solving." After the AI finished its evaluation, Jake and Zarathek spent time analyzing their individual proposals against their collaborative effort. The differences were striking. Both of their solo solutions had significant blind spots that their partnership had identified and addressed. "I missed the security implications entirely," Jake admitted, reviewing his individual work. "I was so focused on the political relationships that I didn't adequately consider the practical challenges of implementation, and I underestimated the importance of addressing the underlying grievances. I assumed that a fair distribution of benefits would be sufficient to maintain peace, but your analysis of the communication patterns showed why that approach has failed in the past. Do you think this kind of collaboration would work in other contexts?" Zarathek considered this carefully. "In military planning, we often use team analysis for complex operations, but this felt different, more organic. Less about dividing responsibilities and more about building understanding together. Is that significant in Vorthak culture?" "Very." We value individual excellence, but the highest achievements in our society come from partnerships where the combined capability exceeds the sum of individual strengths. It is rare to find someone from another species who can engage in this kind of intellectual synthesis. As they prepared to leave, Jake found himself thinking about the 3 trials they had completed. Each one had revealed something unexpected about how he and Zarathek could work together. More than that, each challenge had taught him something new about himself, his own capabilities, limitations, and potential for growth. What's next, he asked. Tomorrow evening. The trial of creativity. This one will be different from what you might expect. Different how? The previous trials have tested specific capabilities. Creativity measures something more fundamental about how you approach problems that have no established solutions. Should I be worried? Zarathek's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile, though with those slightly predatory teeth it was hard to be certain. You should be prepared to surprise yourself. That evening, Jake found himself reviewing not just the day's trial, but the entire experience so far. He was still losing more than winning in traditional terms, but something else was happening. Each challenge was teaching him more about Zarathek's mind, her values, her way of approaching the world. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that she was learning about him, too. The trials weren't really about proving his worth according to Vorthak's standards. They were about discovering whether 2 people from very different backgrounds could find ways to complement and strengthen each other, whether they could build something together that neither could achieve alone. And so far, the answer seemed to be yes. 4 trials down, 3 to go. Jake was beginning to think that regardless of the final outcome, these challenges were changing both of them in ways that would last long after the trials ended. Whether that led to the kind of partnership Zarathek was hoping for remained to be seen, but Jake was increasingly certain that it would lead to something meaningful. The creativity trial would be another piece of the puzzle, another opportunity to discover what they might be capable of together. And for the first time since this had all begun, Jake found himself looking forward to the challenges not because he thought he might win, but because he was genuinely curious about what they might create together. Jake arrived at the designated location for the creativity trial to find himself in an artist's workshop unlike anything he had ever seen. The space was filled with materials from dozens of different worlds, crystalline formations that hummed with harmonic resonances, malleable metals that shifted color based on electrical current, exotic fabrics that seemed to move with their own internal rhythms, and sculptural elements that defied easy categorization. Zarathek was already there, examining what appeared to be a musical instrument of some kind, though its organic curves and crystalline components suggested it came from a civilization with very different concepts of harmony and rhythm than humans possessed. "Welcome to the trial of creativity," she said without looking up from the instrument. "This is perhaps the most important of the 7 trials. More important than strength or intelligence? Those measure existing capabilities. Creativity measures potential, the ability to synthesize new ideas, to find solutions that don't yet exist, to build something meaningful from disparate elements." Jake walked through the space, overwhelmed by the variety of materials available. What exactly are we supposed to create? Something that represents the concept of partnership between our species. You have 4 hours. The result will be evaluated not for technical skill, but for originality, meaning, and the ability to communicate complex ideas through creative expression. Any medium? Any combination of available materials. The only requirement is that your creation must be something that could not exist in either human or Vorthak culture alone. Jake studied the materials more carefully, beginning to understand the scope of the challenge. This wasn't about making something beautiful or technically impressive. It was about finding a way to represent the synthesis of 2 very different ways of understanding the world. "My condition for this trial," he said, after several minutes of consideration. "Yes?" "We create separate pieces, but they must be designed to work together. 2 distinct expressions that combine into something greater than either individual creation." Zarathek's golden eyes brightened with interest. "A paired creation, that is, ambitious. And risky? If our individual pieces don't complement each other properly, the combined result could be worse than either alone. But if it works, it would be a perfect demonstration of the concept we're trying to represent." "Agreed. 4 hours. Then we see whether our creative approaches can harmonize." They worked in different sections of the workshop, each developing their own interpretation of human-Vorthak partnership. Jake found himself drawn to the interactive elements, materials that responded to touch, proximity, or sound. His diplomatic background had taught him to think about communication not just as words, but as the complex interplay of gesture, tone, timing, and context. He began with a base structure of woven crystalline fibers that created different harmonic frequencies based on tension and arrangement. The crystals came from a world where the native species communicated through vibrational patterns, and Jake discovered that by adjusting the weaving pattern, he could create chord progressions that felt emotionally resonant even to his human ears. Over this harmonic foundation, he layered elements that responded to proximity and touch. Panels of color-shifting metal that would warm and brighten when approached, creating visual patterns that complemented the auditory base. The overall effect was of something that invited interaction, that became more complex and beautiful when engaged with directly. But Jake's true innovation was in the temporal element. His creation was designed to change over time, with patterns that shifted slowly enough to be noticed, but quickly enough to maintain interest. It was meant to represent the way relationships developed, not static, but constantly evolving in response to the actions and attention of the participants. Across the workshop, Zarathek was working with more structural materials, metals and stones, and what appeared to be some kind of organic polymer that hardened into predetermined shapes. Her approach was more architectural, building something that looked like it could exist in three-dimensional space rather than just being observed. When the 4 hours ended, they brought their creations to the center of the workshop space. Jake's piece resembled a complex musical sculpture, all flowing lines and responsive surfaces. Zaratheg's looked like an abstract representation of a building or monument, with strong geometric forms that created interesting negative spaces and shadow patterns. "They're completely different," Jake observed, feeling a sinking sensation in his stomach. "Yes," Zarathek agreed, but her tone was thoughtful rather than disappointed. "Show me how yours works." Jake demonstrated the interactive elements, explaining how touch and proximity affected the visual and auditory patterns, how the temporal changes were meant to represent growth and adaptation. Zarathek listened intently, occasionally reaching out to test the responses herself. "Now show me yours," Jake said. Zarathek's creation was more complex than he initially realized. What he had taken for simple geometric forms were actually precisely calculated acoustic chambers, designed to amplify and focus sound in specific ways. The negative spaces weren't just aesthetic choices. They were functional elements that would direct airflow, light, and sound according to carefully planned patterns. "It's meant to be a performance space," she explained. "A place where different forms of artistic expression could be combined and enhanced." Jake stared at her creation, then at his own, then back again. Suddenly he began to see how they might work together. "What if we combined them?" he asked. "Your architectural piece as the space, mine as the interactive element within it?" They spent the next hour reconfiguring their creations, adjusting proportions, and redesigning interfaces. Jake's flowing, responsive sculpture fit into the acoustic chambers of Zarathek's architectural piece like it had been designed for that specific space. More than that, the combination created new possibilities that neither piece had possessed alone. The harmonic vibrations from Jake's crystalline elements resonated through Zarathek's acoustic chambers, creating complex wave patterns that could be felt as well as heard. The color-shifting panels reflected off the polished surfaces of her geometric forms, creating visual patterns that filled the entire space with slowly shifting light. The temporal elements of Jake's design were amplified by the spatial elements of Zarathek's, creating an environment that seemed to breathe and pulse with its own rhythm. When they finally stepped back to observe their combined creation, both were breathing hard from the intense focus required to merge two completely different artistic visions. "It works," Jake said, amazement clear in his voice. "It's better than either piece alone," Zarathek agreed. "Your interactive elements give my structure life and purpose. My architectural design gives your responsive art a context and framework that enhances its impact." They called for the evaluation system, which turned out to be a panel of 3 artistic intelligences from different species, each programmed to assess creativity from their respective cultural perspectives. The Cathara Evaluation AI focused on technical innovation and the integration of diverse materials. Its assessment was highly positive, noting that the combination demonstrated mastery of multiple artistic traditions while creating something genuinely new. The Christech AI evaluated conceptual depth and symbolic meaning. It identified the piece as a successful representation of symbiotic relationships, where different elements enhanced each other's capabilities without losing their individual characteristics. But it was the Aquarian AI's assessment that surprised them both. Aquarian culture emphasized emotional resonance and the ability of art to create connections between different forms of consciousness. "This creation," the Aquarian AI observed, "demonstrates something rarely seen in cross-species artistic collaboration. Most such efforts represent compromise, a reduction of each culture's contributions to find common ground. This piece represents synthesis. each cultural approach enhanced and elevated by interaction with the other. Furthermore, it continued, the temporal elements create an experience that changes based on the observer's level of engagement. Casual observation reveals basic aesthetic pleasures. Extended interaction reveals deeper layers of meaning and complexity. This suggests that the creators understand partnership not as a fixed state, but as an ongoing process of discovery. After the evaluation, Jake and Zarathik spent time interacting with their combined creation, exploring the various ways they responded to different types of engagement. Jake found himself fascinated by how Zarathek approached the interactive elements, more deliberately than he did, but with a focus on understanding the underlying systems rather than just enjoying the surface effects. "Your people approach art differently than mine do," he observed. "How so?" "You're analyzing it, trying to understand how it works, what principles govern its behavior. Humans tend to focus more on how it makes us feel. And you find my approach lacking?" "Not lacking, different. But when I watch you interact with the piece, I see things I missed. The way the harmonic patterns follow mathematical progressions, the way the color shifts correspond to specific vibrational frequencies. You're finding structure where I was just seeing beauty." Zarathek paused in her exploration of the acoustic elements. "And when I watch you, I see emotional responses that I wouldn't have thought to look for. You relate to the temporal changes as if they have personal meaning. You find narrative and patterns that I would analyze as abstract systems. Does that difference concern you?" "No. It intrigues me. Look what we created when we combined those different approaches." They stood together in the space they had built, surrounded by the slowly shifting patterns of light and sound that their collaboration had brought into existence. The piece was beautiful, but more than that, it was meaningful in a way that neither could have achieved alone. "5 trials down," Jake said. 2 to go. "Tomorrow is the trial of courage." "What does that involve?" Zarathek's expression became serious. "That will depend on what you most fear, and whether you're willing to face it." As they prepared to leave, Jake found himself thinking about the pattern that was emerging from these trials. Each one revealed not just his capabilities, but the ways his human perspective could complement Zarathek's Vorthak approach. More importantly, each trial was teaching them both something about the potential for genuine partnership between their species. The creativity trial had been the most revealing yet, showing that their different ways of thinking and approaching problems weren't obstacles to overcome, but resources to be utilized. When they worked together, they were capable of creating something that transcended either of their individual abilities. 2 trials remained: courage and understanding. Jake suspected those would be the most challenging yet, not because they tested specific skills, but because they would require him to be completely honest about who he was and what he was capable of becoming. But for the first time since accepting Zarathek's challenge, Jake felt truly confident about the outcome, not because he expected to win, but because he was beginning to understand that the trials had already accomplished their real purpose. They had shown him and Zarathek that they could build something meaningful together, something that honored both their differences and their potential for synthesis. Whatever came next, they would face it as partners. Jake had expected the trial of courage to involve some form of physical danger, perhaps a test of his willingness to face superior odds or confront a threatening situation. What he hadn't expected was to find himself in a small, private chamber aboard Nexus Station, facing nothing more threatening than Zarathek and a simple recording device. "The trial of courage," she explained, settling into a chair across from him, "is not about facing external threats. Any warrior can find bravery in combat when the stakes are clear and the enemy is visible. True courage is the willingness to be vulnerable in the presence of someone who matters to you." Jake felt his mouth go dry. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means you must share something about yourself that you would prefer to keep hidden, something you fear would change how others see you. And, The recording device on the small table between them was obviously Vorthak technology, sleek, organic-looking, with no visible controls or indicators. Jake stared at it, understanding that whatever they said would become part of the permanent trial record. "My condition for this trial?" he asked, though his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Yes. We don't share our vulnerabilities as separate confessions. We share them as part of a conversation about who we are together." Zarathek's golden eyes widened slightly. "You wish to make this about partnership rather than individual courage? I think real courage in a relationship is about being honest about how your fears and weaknesses affect your ability to connect with another person." For a long moment, Zarathek studied his face with that unsettling intensity he had come to know well. "You continue to surprise me. Very well. We will explore vulnerability as a shared experience. She activated the recording device with a gesture, then sat back in her chair. I will begin. Jake Morrison, what I am about to tell you is known by no other person outside my immediate family. Jake felt his pulse quicken. The formal tone suggested this was more than just personal revelation. It was a significant cultural gesture. I am 34 years old, Zarathek began. In Vorthak society, that makes me quite mature for someone who has never formed a life partnership. Most of my contemporaries have been bonded for years. Some have offspring. She paused, and Jake caught something vulnerable in her expression that he had never seen before. The reason I remain unbonded is not by choice. I have issued 7 formal challenges over the past decade. All were declined. Not because the potential partners questioned my worthiness, but because they found my approach to partnership incompatible with traditional Vorthak relationship structures. How so? Traditional Vorthak partnerships involve clear hierarchies. One partner leads, the other supports. The roles may shift depending on circumstances, but the structure remains. I want something different. I want equals. Jake felt something shift in his understanding of why she had challenged him. Your people see that as weakness? Not weakness. Confusion? A failure to understand proper relationship dynamics? Several of my family members have suggested that my military service has given me unrealistic expectations about personal partnerships. But you don't agree. I believe that the strongest partnerships are between individuals who can lead when their skills are needed and follow when their partner's expertise is superior. I want a mate who challenges me, who makes me grow, who can teach me things I don't know. Zarathek leaned forward, her golden eyes intense. Your turn. What vulnerability do you fear sharing with me? Jake took a deep breath, realizing that his own fear was somehow connected to hers. I'm afraid that I'm not capable of the kind of deep partnership you're looking for. Explain. My longest relationship lasted 2 years. She left because she said I was more committed to my work than to her. The one before that ended because I couldn't make time for the kind of emotional intimacy she needed. Before that, it was because I was too focused on my military career. The words came easier once he started, though. They still felt like admissions of failure. I'm good at working with people professionally. I understand alien cultures, diplomatic protocols, military hierarchies, but personal relationships, I struggle with vulnerability. With a kind of trust that goes beyond professional respect. Why do you think that is? Because being vulnerable means accepting that someone else's needs and feelings matter as much as your own mission objectives. And I've spent my entire adult life in environments where mission success was the highest priority. Jake met her eyes directly. What scares me about these trials is not that I might fail to meet Vorthak standards for partnership. It's that I might discover I'm incapable of real intimacy with anyone, regardless of their species. They sat in silence for several moments, the recording device capturing not just their words, but the weight of their shared revelations. Jake, Zarathek said finally, do you believe that your previous relationship failures were entirely your fault? I think I was a significant contributing factor, but do you think the relationships failed because you were fundamentally incapable of partnership, or because you had not yet found someone whose needs and approaches were compatible with your own? Jake considered this carefully. I'm not sure. How would I know the difference? By examining how you behave when partnership is working. How have you responded during these trials? I've tried to find ways for us to succeed together rather than competing. Yes. Even when traditional victory was impossible, you sought ways to create shared accomplishments. When you could not beat me in combat, you focused on learning from me. When you could not match my speed, you found ways to make our coordination more important than individual velocity. Zarathek leaned back, her expression thoughtful. In every trial, you have demonstrated the exact qualities I seek in a partner. The willingness to adapt, to grow, to find strength in cooperation rather than domination. But those were artificial situations, controlled environments with clear objectives. All relationships involve artificial situations with clear objectives, Jake. The question is whether you can approach them with the same creativity and commitment you've shown in these trials. The conversation continued for another hour, moving from their initial vulnerabilities to deeper questions about what they each wanted from life, what they feared, what gave their existence meaning and purpose. Jake found himself sharing things he had never articulated before. Not just about his relationship history, but about his dreams, his sense of purpose, his fear that his dedication to service might be a way of avoiding deeper personal connections. Zarathek revealed her own struggles with the expectations of her culture, her frustration with traditional gender roles that didn't match her personality, Her fear that her desire for an equal partnership was really just a fear of the vulnerability required for traditional Vorthak bonding. When the recording ended, they sat in the comfortable silence that sometimes develops between people who have shared something significant. "Was that the courage trial?" Jake asked. "Yes, though it was unlike any I have heard described before." "Do you think we passed?" "I think we learned something important about each other. Whether that constitutes passing depends on what happens in the final trial." The trial of understanding was scheduled for the following evening, their last night on Nexus Station before the diplomatic delegations dispersed back to their home systems. Jake spent the day in final trade negotiations, but his attention was divided between the complex details of mineral extraction rights and the awareness that his relationship with Zarathek was about to reach some kind of conclusion. The final trial took place in her personal quarters, a space that reflected Vorthak aesthetic preferences while incorporating personal touches that spoke to her individual personality. The main room was decorated with what appeared to be weapons from different worlds, but arranged as art pieces rather than functional tools. Books and data storage devices suggested intellectual interests beyond military service. "The trial of understanding," Zarathek explained, "has no specific format. It simply requires that we demonstrate complete understanding of each other's perspectives, motivations, and needs. How is that measured? By our ability to predict each other's responses to hypothetical situations. By our capacity to explain each other's viewpoints to a third party. By our success in identifying what the other person needs to feel fulfilled and valued." They spent hours in conversation exploring scenarios and testing their understanding of each other's thought processes. Jake discovered that Zarathek's military precision was balanced by a deep appreciation for artistic expression and philosophical complexity. She learned that his diplomatic flexibility was grounded in strong personal principles about justice and the value of different perspectives. But the real test came when they began discussing practical questions about how a genuine partnership between them might work. "If we were to pursue this beyond the trials," Zarathek said, "what would concern you most?" Jake considered the question seriously. "The practical challenges. I'm based on Earth. You're presumably stationed wherever the Vorthak military needs you. Our careers involve obligations that might conflict with personal relationships. Those are logistical problems. What would concern you emotionally?" "The fear that I would disappoint you the same way I disappointed previous partners. That my focus on work would make you feel neglected or unimportant." "And what would you need from me to feel secure in such a partnership?" "Patience while I learn how to balance professional and personal commitments. Understanding that my dedication to service isn't about avoiding intimacy, but about fulfilling responsibilities I can't simply abandon." They continued this exchange, each question revealing more about their expectations, fears, and hopes. Jake began to understand that Zarathek's desire for an equal partner wasn't about rejecting Vorthak culture, but about finding ways to honor her individual nature within her cultural framework. Zarathek recognized that Jake's relationship struggles weren't about inability to commit, but about never having found someone who appreciated his way of showing care and dedication. As the evening progressed, they found themselves sitting closer together, the formal structure of the trial giving way to something more intimate and natural. "Jake," Zarathek said finally, "I believe we understand each other well enough to complete the trials, but I have one final question." "Yes. If I told you that I wanted to pursue an actual relationship with you, not as part of Vorthak tradition or diplomatic curiosity, but because I believe we could build something meaningful together, what would your response be?" Jake looked into her golden eyes, thinking about everything they had shared over the past week. The physical challenges that had taught him about persistence and adaptation. The intellectual collaboration that had shown him new ways of thinking about problems. The creative partnership that had produced something neither could have imagined alone. The emotional vulnerabilities they had shared with each other. "I would say that I'm terrified of the practical complications, uncertain about whether I can be the kind of partner you deserve, and completely certain that I want to try." Zarathek's smile was unlike any expression he had seen from her before, not predatory or challenging, but warm and genuine and hopeful. "Then we have both passed the trials," she said, "though I suspect the real testing is just beginning." 6 months later, Jake received a new assignment, liaison officer for expanded human Vorthak cultural exchange, based on Nexus Station, but with regular travel to both Earth and the Vorthak homeworld. Zara Zarek had received a parallel assignment as military attaché for the same program. They had been partnered professionally by their respective governments who were eager to build on the success of their collaboration during the trade negotiations. What their governments didn't know was that they had also been partnered personally by a series of trials that had tested not just their compatibility, but their willingness to grow and change for each other. The mating trials had ended with Jake losing most of the individual challenges, but winning something more important: the beginning of a relationship built on mutual respect, intellectual stimulation, and the kind of partnership that made both of them stronger than they were alone. As Jake settled into his new quarters on Nexus Station, he reflected on the lessons Zarathek had taught him about winning and losing. Sometimes, failing to achieve your initial objective was the key to discovering what you really needed. Sometimes losing every battle was the perfect preparation for winning a war you hadn't realized you were fighting. And sometimes, the best victory was the one that left both participants stronger, wiser, and more capable of facing whatever challenges the galaxy might send their way. The trials were over, but the partnership they had forged was just beginning. Jake had a feeling it was going to be the most challenging and rewarding mission of his life,